Hello, welcome to Varn Vlog. Now, I'm doing something a little bit unorthodox on the Radical Engagement show for a while. I'm still going to be covering articles of all kinds of varieties one day a week, maybe 2 days a week if need be. But I think I'm going to devote Thursdays to the Marxist Unity Group's publications, both of which are available. I'm not going to do all of this one, although I probably will cover it. Fight the Constitution for a Democratic Socialist Republic, selected writers from the Marxist Unity Group from Cosmonaut Press, published back in 2023. I like some of the essays in this book quite a bit, but that's not what I'm covering, because I want you to go and probably get this book for yourself. I will cover parts of it, though, eventually. No, I'm covering a reader on Marxist strategy compiled by the Marxist Unity Group, or the Marxist Unity Group reader. And I'm covering it for a variety of reasons. I have become interested in the critique of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists for America, but you could see me now as part of the internal opposition. I have joined the movement, but it should be a movement. It should become a movement. And all the things I've said about it in the past, I still stand by. Still not comfortable giving my money to Democratic candidates, but I need skin in the game, and my prior attempts to do that have not really gone that well. I'm still associated with some workers groups. I'm still in a union. None of that's changing. And in fact, this is a way to kind of tie that all together. If it doesn't work, or if I don't think the partyist and worker-centric elements of the DSA are actually really there, or have any chance of winning, I probably won't stay, because I don't believe in being a group that you cannot be democratically bound by. Meaning, like, you cannot, if you do not agree, you don't have to agree with everything, but if you do not agree with enough of the group's mission to be democratically bound by it, then you should not be in that group. And while I am still hesitant of parts of the DSA's platform, the recent convention's decisions on the party and some other things want me to be involved. Also, I work with the DSA locally, whether I want to or not, because they are involved in the worker centers and unions that I participate with. And I'm not going to go into name those, because I'm not at liberty to speak for those organizations, although I am a rep in my union. I don't want you to know where I work for my day job, although you could probably look it up if you tried. The reason why I want to do this is I've gone through, before I went through the bunch of the caucuses, and DSA caucuses change radically. I discovered a new one today, but change radically all the time. They are kind of in flux. But I went through the DSA caucuses reading list to their internal groupings a few years back. It's behind the Patreon wall, but if you dig it up, I covered the reading list of the Bread and Roses. I covered the reading list of Reform Revolution. I think I did. I covered the reading list of the Communist Caucus, and I covered that was publicly available. And I covered the basic reading list of the Marxist Unity Group. Since then, they've compiled a reader, and the Marxist Unity Group is the group I know the most people in nationally. I have connections to Red Star. I think I know someone from the Winter Caucus. I know the parts of the Class Unity that are still in DSA, although I don't think there are many left. Nonetheless, this is where I am. It was a lot of soul searching and arguing with DSAers, frankly, that got me to do this, because in a way, it's the skin in the game issue. Now, this brings me to why cover the Marxist Unity Group reader. Well, I've been following some of the founders of Cosmonaut Magazine and the Marxist Unity Group Donald Parkinson, Peter, Myra, Parker, Luke Pickerel, a bunch of these people I have known online since years before Cosmonaut even was a thing. All right. I think Donald and I and Peter and I go back decades at this point. And this is where I want to kind of devote the most time, because I know the thought processes that led to some of the conclusions here, but it's been developed far beyond, what I initially saw in my interaction with Donald and Peter and Parker and those guys. I also know a lot of people who hate the Marxist Unity Group and hate Cosmonaut Magazine with the passion of a thousand suns, that feel burnt by them and aren't happy with it. And I was in between a kind of what we call a mini sect war between Emancipation Network, and which was really a subset that broke off from Swamp Side and Cosmonaut for a long time. I lost friends over it. So there's reasons why I want to cover this. And I also want to make a decision for me about what they're trying to do. So you're actually going to see a lot of my real-time thinking on air about this grouping within the DSA. They're the grouping that I'm most sympathetic towards in a lot of ways, but also am still skittish on a few things, and I want to work that out. All that said, and that's a long introduction to this, the best way to do that is to go by what they would consider their most basic syllabus for education, in addition to the various programs they want you to read, which are most of the social democratic and Bolshevik programs until 1918. I did point out many years ago when I talked about that I wonder why they didn't include the 1918 ABCs of Communism, aka the Bolshevik program, and the 21 points, which were crucial for membership, many of which the 21 points I take a lot more issue with than the ABCs of Communism. And I have that somewhere out here. Maybe one day I should cover that as well. But let's get into this reader. And we'll be doing this off and on for a while. There'll be some weeks I don't touch it, but because it's also very, very long, it's 500 pages, it's going to be the longest thing I have done on radical engagements. And since I go line by line, it might be a while. Now, I have covered books on radical engagements before, but they tend to be behind the Patreon wall. But this is available and published for the public. So I don't feel bad about it. This is freely available on the internet. It's completely and totally open. So I do not feel like I am endangering anyone's ability to make money by covering it publicly. And it's also multiple texts. So I'm not also really just reading one. I mean, I am reading one book, but it's a compilation reader. I'm not reading, one book by one author, which I will sometimes do if those books are mostly in the public domain, like Hal Draper's books are behind the paywall. Okay, so that's the justification for what we're doing. Let's get into it. Marxist Unity Group with their penchant for kind of what I consider neo early 20th century designs. Although I do say they tend to have good layout. I don't know why you'd use a German font though. Anyway, so here you go. We have Lenin reading a book. A reader on Marxist Strategy by Marxist Unity Group. Contents. There's lots of stuff in here. Lots of classic text. So we will talk about what they chose. All right, so we'll start with the prefaces here. When this book was first compiled, Marxist Unity was a group of 7 people who had been working together at Cosmonaut for 3 years, and had only just begun to formalize our political views by making a coordinated intervention at the DSA 2021 convention. We had since held 2 courses where prospective members and facilitators studied it together, and therefore it was therefore necessary to update it based on these experiences, both on a technical level, layout, and more importantly, on the editorial level of content. The astute reader will notice significant changes between the table of contents between the first and third edition. To make it more readable, we focus less on primary sources, which need to always be placed in their historical context to be understood. Agreed. I tried to do that here. And replace some of the best contemporary secondary sources. We also divided the first week's readings into 2 in order to lighten the load, and we added a section from Neil Harding's groundbreaking study of Lenin, which in the 1970s set the stage for the critique of the textbook interpretation. Besides the last 2 sections, most significant change was taking out the section entitled Democratic Revolution to the End, which included Marx and Engels' famous 1850 address, Lenin's 2 tactics, and a few other articles. It was too much of a detour to unpack the specifics of the peasantry in the 1905 revolution and felt eclectic to connect it to the address. However, the issues of permanent revolution, its relation to the Bolshevik strategy of hegemony, and what it means to us from the vantage point of the 21st century are important and messy theoretical issues that do need to be unpacked and understood by Marxists. And I think they probably dealt with this because it's controversial within the Marxist Unity group. I don't know that, really don't know that, but nonetheless, I suspect that's why. Sections 8 and 9 also saw significant revisions in the first and second edition. The last section, The Social Republic, was curriculum shortest in Swedish. We decided to expand it to include Marx's most important political work, his commentary on the peasant commune from the Civil War in France, as well as commentary on Lenin's State and Revolution. That's interesting because I've known the Cosmonaut people have felt a little bit more uncomfortable with State and Rev than they do many other Lenin texts. They tend to like what is to be done. The final section is a new edition. It's focused on groundbreaking the preceding sections in U.S. history, as well as pointing towards strategic objective for our time and place. And I would say this book that I mentioned in the beginning is more about the United States in specific, but less strategic and less based on classic text. It's writers of Cosmonaut and members of the Marxist Unity group writing together. And I'll cover some of these as I see fit if they're relevant to the readings. Which I guess is me making a curricular intervention in a group I'm not in. But nonetheless. Despite Section 9's U.S. focus, it should be clear that Bunker rejects putting forward an analysis based entirely on the current conjecture. Thank God. Part of our hypothesis is in the broad sense, there are only a few strategic choices available to the working class, and all of them now have significant historic case studies. The mistake of privileging the conjecture obscures the tendencies of capital and the bourgeois state within the longue durée of history. My favorite word. People used to do a drinking game when I say longue durée, and thus obscures the task of the rising class, in our case, the proletariat. We hope this edition of the curriculum, one that's more collaboratively and hopefully easier to read, we'll see about that, will be more closely in its finalized form and can be seen as a definitive statement of our tendencies views. PM, I'm guessing that's Peter, March 2023. Preface to the first edition. For the most part, the list of materials included in this reader is not the usual one found in Marxist educational curriculum. It is not intended to be an exhaustive introduction to Marxism. We've already assuming a basic level of familiarity, nor as a complete roadmap for the Marxist intervention in the contemporary United States. Thus, it necessarily excludes topics that are essential to the formulation and victory of the working class and taking power on the questions of political economy and the relationship to Black liberation, how Marxists should respond to the threat of the far right, what strategy socialists should take in trade unions and tenants movements, etc. All these questions and more need to be thoroughly investigated by the Marxist Unity Group and the DSA as a whole to further develop our politics together. Obviously, you need statements on this that you're not going to find in classic text. Are you going to find them in the middle of the 20th century, not the beginning of the 20th century or the 19th? Our view is the main challenge for socialists in the US. It's the last of a Marxist party. This is why we don't even have a labor party. This is why our reader emphasizes key texts from a period when the socialist parties were forming into mass organs of the working class struggle. These texts are all from the influential European Marxists between 1871 and 1910, with the exception of Lenin's left-wing communism. And I guess parts of State and Revolution have been added, which are also later than 1910. And the secondary sources reflecting and analyzing the period. In the 4 decades between the Paris Commune and World War I, Marxism seemed to spread through the continental working class as rapidly as Napoleon's army had a few generations prior. It is also in this era the revolutionary theoretical work of Marx, 1888 to 1833, and Engels, 1820 to 1895, was successfully transformed into a mass political practice in the newly united Germany by their closest comrades, Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel. This strategy further elaborated for mass proletarian audience by Karl Kautsky, a man who I am profoundly ambivalent of, but who I think is important and often neglected, although he's less neglected now, and his greatest pupil, a certain Russian lawyer with an acerbic pen, Vladimir Lenin, 1870 to 1924. Avoid strokes, friends. At the beginning of this conjuncture, socialists in Europe were divided into small competing sects and reeling from a long series of defeats. The demoralizing retreats, including the failure of the 1848 revolutions in the Paris Commune, the dissolution of the First International, the Spanish Bourbon restoration that ended the Sexennico Democratico, and the lording over Europe by aristocratic reactionaries like Metternich, Napoleon III, and Bismarck. Not unlike the contemporary far left sectarian irrelevancy following the Soviet collapse and the global counter-revolutionary plague of neoliberalism. And I mean, there's been multiple counter-revolutionary plagues. It's not just neoliberalism, but I agree neoliberalism is the biggest one because it affected the mode of production most profoundly. By the end of the conjecture, however, the sects had united to build Marxist parties and deeply integrated into the working class with their own democratic civil societies. Asterisk. I'm really fascinated by this in the Italian case because the Italian case produced some of the most reactionary things within Marxism, but also saw, parts of the Black International, by that I mean the Anarchist Internationals, rejoin the Marxist, and a bunch of other things happened in the late 19th and early 20th century Italy. Italian communism is very interesting and kind of goes a different way than most of the rest of the Second International. But I don't think it's really a good case study for the United States. So anyway. They elected benches of revolutionary parliamentarians who are answerable to the rank and file and committed to international proletarian solidarity over patriotic national unity. Still a problem to this day. Jingoistic and chauvinistic socialists have returned en masse, and revolutionary democratic republicanism over narrow reformism and economist laborism, aka over the Fabians and the Bernsteinites. Or at least this was the ideal presented on the surface in the resolutions and congresses of the Second International. See Mike Tabor under a socialist banner, the resolutions of the Second International, 1889 to 1912, Haymarket 2021. Yeah, I would say probably a lot messier than the text probably indicate. But that's always the case. The text always cleans things up. It is the first period of successful and even mass party building by Marxists, and it was only the foundations of these parties that the question of taking power was even conceivable in Europe during the revolutionary period of 1917 to 1921, aka the aftermath of World War I. The imperative of revolutionary democratic and mass party building is the first reason we chose these texts. As every leftist knows, there was deep rot at the center of the Second International. As the various national sections started to drop their revolutionary principles against their own national ruling, classes one by one in the spirit of 1914 when the war was declared. Serbia, Russia, and the United States were the people in the Second International who did not do that. I've always found it interesting that I don't talk about the United States. And Italy declared neutrality. So those are the off cases of the people who subjected themselves to the national ruling classes. Serbia, Russia, most famously. But also Debs's SPA, the Socialist Party of America, and then there was neutrality in the Italian Socialist Party. But, that led to all kinds of other messes that we could get into, including, the left communist faction in Italy, which is interesting. Later on, autonomia, various parts of Eurocommunism. It also led to Gramsci and the kind of Marxist center of their time. It led to Tosca and a lot of the right wing deviationists, and it led to fascism. I mean, because we have to admit that the maximalist section of the Italian socialist is what produced Mussolini. So that's very interesting. But Italy was at least neutral. And we can also see that the rest of the European parties, with the exception of Serbia and Russia, went with their national causes. And the United States was very much not in with that. And also the Delonists weren't in with that either. So the American socialist tradition, weirdly, despite all its jingoism and yellow liberalism and everything else that the early SPA was subject to, was not guilty on that one front. All right. This was a world historic tragedy. It was by no means an inevitability, as the usual Marxist just so story goes. Marxists inherited this narrative from the history presented by the Comintern in the period of 1920 and 1921, when the proletarian revolution was on the immediate agenda and the remnants of the Second International was scabbing against the world's first workers' regime. It took a long, even taking a position that wasn't totally anti the Third International, like the Austro-Marxists, took a long time. And when the Social Democrats finally got there, they were mostly dead. All right. The Soviet regime was locked in an international struggle for life or death, and it thus overemphasized its break with orthodox Marxism of the Second International. Lenin himself acknowledged his grounding in Second International politics. In Lenin's words, when and where did I call the revolution of Babel and Kautsky opportunism? When and where did I ever claim to have created any special trend in the international democracy not identical with the trend of Babel and Kautsky? Two Tactics, Chapter 8. Lenin called Kautsky a renegade, not a fool, and that's important to remember. A full accounting of the relationship between the Second International and the Third Internationals between Kautsky and Lenin is beyond the scope of this article, or like even most books. Many polemics that read by Maoist, Trotskyist, and Marxist, Leninists, etc., repeated things that were repeated around this time period that weren't even totally true, like that Kautsky actually supported the war bonds. He didn't. He didn't vote against them either. He took a cowardly way out and then went with the majority so that they could present a united front once the Democratic vote was made. Anyway, suffice it to say that just so story inherited by the contemporary left is a historical caricature. For a comprehensive review, see Ben Lewis's Introduction to Kautsky on Democracy and Republicanism, Haymarket 2020. However, and Ben Lewis's work is great, by the way. However, the matter of Lenin's critique of Kautsky is one of the most widely read pamphlets on the left. State and Revolution should be addressed. In his 1920 pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism, Lenin, referring to Kautsky when he was still a Marxist and not a renegade, wrote on the very first page, "How well did Kautsky wrote 18 years ago?" Yeah, and later Kautsky doesn't sound like early Kautsky at all. I've read post-1921 Kautsky. It's very, very different. Anyway, in 1917, State and Revolution, however, he accuses Kautsky in his pre-renegade period of never having sufficiently grasped Marxist revolutionary theory of the state. I'm not sure anyone has, myself, contrasting what Kautsky didn't say in his polemics with Bernstein's revisionism with what Marx wrote on the Paris Commune and the Civil War in France. In fact, according to Lars Lee, who I'm a little bit more ambivalent about than most smug people, but we can get there, State and Revolution is the only place that Lenin substantively criticized Kautsky, but he was still a Marxist. However, writing in the Swiss exile without access to his library's complete works of Kautsky, Lenin had apparently forgotten a pamphlet Kautsky had written, which directly addresses the commune and represents Marxist theory of the state. Kautsky's social democracy in Republican France was a scathing polemic against the French socialists. Man, the French socialists come up a lot as being a problem. Alexandre Millerand and his supporters. Millerand had set off a controversy in the international social democracy when he joined the bourgeois coalition cabinet in Pierre Waldeck-Rousseau's government of Republican defense against the far right. The first Popular Front, actually, in many ways. I even believe that the Popular Front as a term maybe comes from this. Alongside General de Gaulle, I think, who was known as the Commune's executioner. It is remarkable that Kotsky's pamphlet was only published in English in October 2020 by Ben Lewis in his above-mentioned book. I told you should fucking read Ben Lewis. He's on my show, I think. Yeah. His book is great, as is a major political work of the prominent Marxist thinker between Engels and Lenin. And particularly relevant to our context as it articulates orthodox Marxism, a term I hate because it gets ruined by people abusing Lukács later. Our revolutionary social democracy, a term that is confusing to most modern ears because social democratic democracy's Keynesian turn in the 1950s. Strategy in this context of the so-called high inclusion democracy rather than low inclusion regimes of Finland or Germany are autocracies like the Russian Empire. The second reason for the choice of these texts and their common emphasis on the centrality of the democratic revolutionary political struggle, since the crystallization of Comintern orthodoxy, Marxist in both Stalinist and Trotskyist form, people don't like either of those words. We should use the polite nomenclature as they prefer to call themselves, Marxist, Leninists, and Leninists, as well as other non-Leninist offshoots. He's probably talking about Council Communists and, well, Bordegists are Leninists, but they're different kind of Leninists. Anyway, you get it. Have inherited an economism that underplays the relevance of revolutionary political democracy. Is he talking crap about Maoists here? I don't know. This led, I should not say he. I'm not assuming this is the work of PM, who I believe is Peter. This has led to both left-wing and right-wing errors, the former made in the assumption that the struggle for political democracy is merely the task of the bourgeois revolution. De Leon hints at this, actually. So this is something that I think is an interesting thing to say is an error, and it probably is an error, but I have to think about it. And the latter, ignoring the struggle against the bourgeois rule of law and specific political form of the class state, which all states are classed, only working towards a democratic reform within the legalist constitutional loyalist schema. Rather than conceding the terms democracy to the bourgeois liberal constitutional state, a la what Bordiga does in his critique of democracy, where he considers it just the legal form of the bourgeois constitutional state. If you read his critique of democracy, I have it somewhere in here. It's over there. I'm going to pull it out right now. You can see this. Whether conceding the term democracy to the bourgeois liberal constitutional state, which their periodist didn't do, but like Bordigas did, Marx held a two-tier scheme of revolution. First, the conquest of political power by the proletariat to form a democratic republic. In other words, the dictatorship of the proletariat. See my discussion on Hal Draper's dictatorship of the proletariat, where I think Hal Draper is mostly right, but maybe a little bit too hard on Lenin, and maybe reads Lenin wrong in a few places, actually. Second, for the transition from the democratic regime of the working class towards communism, the abolition of all classes. Which, I was really grateful that I went to an introduction to socialism by the DSA, and that was actually implied in their definition for the first time I've ever heard them do that. Now, I'm not saying they haven't done it for a while. I haven't heard it. When I went to DSA stuff and talked to DSA in New Orleans in 2018 and here in 2019 and 2020 before COVID, they did no such thing. In the 1847, sorry, my aphasia kicks in with numbers, I tend to flip them, document principles of communism, an alternate draft in the manifesto. Engels put it well. Long quote from Engels, I think. What will be the course of this revolution? Above all, it will establish a democratic constitution, and through this, direct or indirect dominance of the proletariat. Democracy would be wholly valueless to the proletariat if it were not immediately used as a means for putting through the measures against private property and ensuring the livelihood of the proletariat. And long quote. There aren't quotations there, but I know that's a quote. In his critique of the Erfurt program, which I think is an excellent text, Engels again is clear. I've done a show on it. If one thing is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of a democratic republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the Great French Revolution has already shown. The final section of this reader devoted to Marx's conception of the democratic republic, which is consistent with the problematic demands documented in section 2. The reading addresses the questions of organization of the party in sections 1, on the merger formula section 2, which I now think is in section 1, on the maximum minimum program section 4, which I'm actually a defender of the maximum minimum program, and I do think immediate demands and transitions between the maximum and minimum programs actually do need to be worked out. In fact, when I was trying to think of programs, I got way too schematic about it and had like immediate demands, a minimum program, a transitional program, a maximum program, and then extending goals. Because maybe I'm like lawful neutral or something. I don't know. D&D is no way to think about Marxism, but nonetheless, it might be a way. It makes about as much sense as any personality disorder that people throw at you. Section 4 on the party of a new type. Section 7 on fraction politics. However, due to the length of the reader already, and this is pretty long, guys, we have foregone adding a section on the democratic centralism, an important but massively bastardized concept. Yep, I agree. Actually, I've come around on democratic centralism because I think most people, the sects, and even some governments have used democratic centralism abusively. But if you're actually democratic, you're democratically centralist. In that if you are part of a larger org and the larger org votes to do something, yes, you can critique it, which I think you should actually do, but you do have to abide by the rules because you agreed to majority rule when you entered the democratic organization. And sorry, guys, that's how it works. Doesn't mean you have to censor yourself, I don't think, but it does mean you have to go along. To violate that is to say you no longer want to be part of that grouping. All right. Usually only as understood as a militarized party model that was necessarily adopted by the Communist Party under the conditions of civil war. I mean, which is actually funny. I think, can't remember if it's Lars Lee or one of the other thinkers who points out accurately that, believe it or not, democratic centralism was never in place under conditions of civil war or during the underground period, because those are not good times to work democratically. Now, I can go off on parts of the problem of like Lenin's obsession with the centralization of the Prussian military and stuff, and how that actually isn't super great, but that's a specific problem. It is not a problem with democratic centralism. In fact, democratic centralism has a rich history in Marxism prior to the ban on factions, which is what is usually associated with today. Right. I think the faction ban, I have agreed with Mug, is stupid. I've always been a multi-tendencyist. I think it keeps the tendencies honest. And what happens when you do ban factions is actually you don't ban factions. You just have competitions to be one, and it's an all or nothing zero-sum game that can get bloody as hell. All right. You don't need communists and workers killing each other with shit like that. All right. Section 7, which focuses on fraction politics, does explore democratic centralism indirectly without getting into its deeper history by looking at Lenin's electoral strategy for the Russian Social Democrats in the Duma, as well as the intransient Marxist oppositional political strategy of the SPD legislators in the German Reichstag, which I personally make a lot about when I talk about political strategy and abstention. A broad study of the classical Marxist political strategy may not seem like the most immediately relevant political education guide to coherent new tendency within DSA. It doesn't provide us with an obvious answer to tactical questions because it's a strategy reader, not a tactical reader. Come on, guys. I don't mean Mug. I mean people who expect that from us. Like what DSA policy should be towards China. I think that's complicated. But I support anything that starts a détente between the U.S. and China. But China's foreign policy is not always great. It's usually not terrible either. How we implement rank and file strategy. I mean, I don't think you can do that easily. I think you have to do it, but I mean, I don't think that can be done preemptively. I guess is what I'm saying. Whether or not Marxists should engage in so-called mutual aid, they should, but it should be for something larger, not in and of itself. Mutual aid by itself is charity. Or how to relate to liberal NGO coalition partners in the reform campaigns. We can't purge them all. Even so, it is our view that rethinking the whole history of the workers' movement is necessary to achieve the great goal of working with class self-emancipation. The text and this reader provide a starting point in the DSA today, and indeed a writer history of the U.S. left. They focus on rethinking the ideological inherence of Marxism seems as a distraction from doing the work. But what work are you doing? Like, why are you doing it? It really does seem like doing the work is doing the work for what? Like, that's always the case. If you're doing the work and you don't have a for what, you are being a busybody. All right. We call that compulsion. All right. Practical organizing. Yeah, but practical organizing for what? In order for us Marxists to develop a solid political footing in the present and be fully confident of our path ahead, we must be critical of following proper trends of thought and ideological narratives not of our own making. And when we do take in ideological narratives not of our own making, we want to work them in with our own making. I don't think being a pure Marxist makes a lot of sense, because I don't think Marx was a pure Marxist, for one thing, and I don't think it's how thought works. If you're going to do scientific Marxism, you have to pull from new ideas. But I do think we have to always deal with our own frameworks, and they either fit or they don't, or we have to change our frameworks. There's really not two ways about that. Back to this. With a more critical reflection and rethinking of the dominant narratives of left's history, the necessary spread of awareness and widespread reiteration of what is needed to be our movements, aims, or great goals will not be victorious. Okay, true. A particularly vulgar example of this thinking surfaced during the Bowman affair. Internal. Bowman's been a real problem. I mean, he's no longer a problem. Been a real issue for the DSA. Where members of the liquidationist right, I wonder who they're talking about. Graham work didn't exist yet in 2021, did they? Anyway, argued that focusing on internal matters like how to relate to a DSA congressman who frequently broke our Zionism boycott distracted us from outwardly facing organizing we should be doing. There is nothing more than a cynical attempt to shut down criticism of dominant opportunist electoral strategy. However, we would argue that it's precisely the lack of debate on the questions posed in this reader that makes these sort of crises endemic on the left and forces us to reinvent the real strategically, where many of our minds of Marxism have already intensively labored. While we may or may not have every tactical question figured out, you most definitely don't. I don't think, while we may not have every tactical question figured out, I was going to say may or may not. No, you definitely don't. Like, no one does. I don't either. Like, nobody does. Lenin didn't either. That's why you can find Lenin quotes that are against different things at different times. We believe studying these texts together will give us a wider strategic outlook that can build principled unity amongst Marxists towards the basis for a real communist party. PM, January 2022. Lots of scrolling. The merger formula. No, we've been going for 40 minutes, so we'll come back here when we start the actual section 1. No, let's actually go into this a little bit. Section 1, the merger formula summary. The political history of the 19th century was defined by a split between the workers' movement, characterized by the early labor movement, the Chartists in Britain, the Lassalleans in Germany, etc., and the movement of intellectuals trying to better the world on behalf of the working class. But notice the on behalf of, this is important. This is a contradiction that many of us experience on a daily basis today. It's one that comes up when anarchists critique Marxists all the time, although anarchists too have really actually been from the class they claim to represent. So, whatever. That Marxism represents a solution to the contradiction via the merger. The slogan, social democracy is a merger of socialism, the workers' movement, was Kautsky's summation of Marxist political belief. This slogan was taken up by the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, the Social Demokratische Party, Deutschlands, and other parties across the world. The merger was talked about with massive depth of feeling. Within Marxist Union Group, we view the merger formula as one of the most fundamental pillars of Marxism. But the question is, where is the working class movement to which we merge, is what I always say to them. But we are talking about two things when we talk about the merger. The first is a narrative we get in Lee's chapter, and it is part of the formalization of Marxism that came through the manifesto, especially in the first generation of the SPD, and spread through the Second International. And this is the basis for revolutionary strategy by Matt McNair, but whatever. People have, Bosch Carr took and Eric Blanc took a very different lesson from revolutionary strategy. by McNair than Marxist Unity Group. We'll just put it that way. This first narrative says the movement of socialist intellectuals needs to merge with the workers' movement by taking their skills and generalizing them into a party. Most political movements of the time, but also now, are movements of the classes most able to engage in political action. All levels of ownership class, professionals who are labor aristocrats or PMC, depending on what you want to use. I think labor aristocrats is more accurate, but whatever, are their petit bourgeois, which can occasionally be on behalf of the working class, or as a strata within the working class that tries to represent all of it, which is always a sketchy thing to do. That's true for anything, that's class politics. However, charity and advocacy both function by servicing workers while maintaining the resources of the capitalists, or a fiefdom of skills that professionals have. It's one of the problems with professionals. We'll get back there. The merger formula argues that well-meaning professionals should turn their skills to a democratically organized party, which thus spread their knowledge and skills to the whole movement, the reskilling of the working class. Working class also have skills that professionals do not have, such as the ability to socially reproduce themselves via their labor. Although, in my more pessimistic moments today, I would point out that this is nowhere near as true as it was in the early 20th century. It's harder for people to do social labor in the same way because labor has been so socialized that the socialization is now mediated through the commodity itself, which has always been true, but it's really true now in tech, to use a very vague phrase. However, charity and advocacy both function by... I read that. The merger formula argues that well-meaning professionals should turn their skills to a democratically organized party, which thus spread their knowledge and skills to the whole movement. Among the knowledge is the socialist thesis, which is understanding the whole system of exploitation and oppression as the interconnected system that must be overthrown. The knowledge, like administrative skills, is something workers' movement can eventually learn for itself. However, the argument presented by Kotsky and Lee is that it is on socialists to hasten it, which, socialists in the West have done a very bad job of, frankly. This is not the only or even the first time the concept of the merger formula was used. The first time was in Engels' 1844 book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England. Long quote from Engels, this one actually formatted correctly. It is evident that the working class men's movement is divided into two sections, the Chartists and the Socialists. The Chartists are theoretically more backward, the less developed, but are the genuine proletarians all over, representatives of their class. The Socialists are more far-seeing, propose practical remedies against distress, but proceeding originally from the bourgeoisie, which they definitely would have done in this time period, or even the aristocracy, honestly, are for this reason unable to amalgamate completely with the working class. The union of socialism with Chartism, the reproduction of first communism in the English manner, will be the next step and has already begun. Then only, when this has been achieved, will the working class be the true intellectual leaders of England. However, political and social development will proceed and will foster a new party with the departure of Chartism. With the new departure of Chartism. So Chartism or unionism or whatever will be subsumed into socialism, with the Chartist no longer being so separated and theoretically backward, but being the democratic majority of where the organization is going to go. That's what this implies. So the merger formula is found in Engels before even the manifesto was written. Here we see a slightly different version of the merger. Socialists are a segment of the workers' movement, and the workers' movement is Chartism. This group struggled for critical political rights, including universal and equal suffrage. Here we see another critical aspect of Marxism in the 19th century, the struggle for democracy, which later Marxists will turn against, but we'll come back to that. The working class party movement is the struggle for democracy. Think of busy street of offices, small stores, manufacturers, etc. Outside of the conscious efforts by socialists or proto-socialists, the struggles of each particular site could happen without anything to do with each other. See, unions, now. And this is how capitalists prefer it. They would really love if even unions were broken up into sub guilds within the firm, which, like they do in the railroads for no reason whatsoever. All right. But by struggling for democratic rights culminating in a democratic republic, the working class finds itself. Democratic struggles can activate fractions of the class that may otherwise not be touched by the labor movement or work together. It's a de-alienating, not an alienating structure, to put it in ways that are more Hegelian and probably make our structuralist friends and some above a little bit uncomfortable. The battle for democracy is at the core of the workers' collective self-conception as workers. The struggle for democracy makes apparent the denial of universal and equal suffrage is etched into the American Constitution. Yeah. These two conceptions of the merger between socialists and the workers' movements unifying into a socialist party, and between socialism and the struggle for democracy culminating in the democratic republic, play off of each other throughout the history of socialism. So we have two merger formulas, not just one. This is actually a kind of theoretical innovation for what happened in the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Committee with McNair and Ben Lewis and a bunch of other comrades over there. Small group, but very, very diligent working ones. Anyway, they form the boundaries of Marxist politics. Against charity or advocacy, Marxists advocate for empowering the working class itself through the development of consciousness and skills. So you're not just doing the charity thing anymore. You're teaching. What is it the conservatives say? You give a man a fish, he eats for a day. You teach a man a fish, he eats for a lifetime. You teach a man how to reproduce the means of production of fish, and also give him in charge of that reproduction of fish, and everyone eats for a lifetime. Against anarchism and simple trade unionism, Marxists struggle for democracy to unite the whole class and achieve state power. State power here is a little interesting paradox, but we can come back to that another day. While the relationship between these two principles has been in constant tension, we can see the greatest revolutionaries combine the workers' movement and the struggle for democracy. Study questions. Uh-oh. I'm going to have to do study questions. Okay, I realize this is a pedagogical book, so we'll deal with it. Describe the merger formula and its place in the history of social democracy, what you just did. Describe the components of Erfurtianism. We'll come back to that. Describe the circle of awareness. Is this schema applicable to the contemporary socialist movement? Well, I'll be thinking about that as I close read all this. What is the good news conception of social democracy? What is social democracy needed, and why is it still being heeded by the working class? Why is political freedom light and air for the workers' movement? I don't know. Why did you name your journal after that? I mean, the other journal associated with Mug, not Cosmonaut, which is separate from Mug in its own project, but where Mug kind of the Mug's from. It's called Light and Air. I wonder why. What's the history of Light and Air metaphor? How did the Russian Social Democrats describe it? Lee doesn't mention the demand for a democratic republic in the opening chapter. Why might this be the case? Can Lee's conclusions be taken as definitive? Well, you know what I'm probably going to say about that. But there we go. Our first 50 minutes, roughly, introduction to me dealing with Mug, and basically the section 1 errata and the preface. The second preface was actually far more substantive than I thought. I thought it was going to be publication history stuff, but I always read the prefaces because you never know when something's going to be useful in them. All right. Yavul, and protect your peace. And I'm going to have some tea. You guys, something for the world of tomorrow. Something. Goodbye.